we talk about Motown records, most people instantly think of bright, polished stage performances, timeless hits, and a certain slickness that Berry Gordy, the label's founder, masterfully orchestrated. But we rarely talk about the streets around West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, where Gordy first built his empire in a modest-looking house known as Hitsville, USA. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Detroit was a melting pot of cultural and economic forces, the booming automobile industry, thousands of workers migrating from the South, and a rich musical tapestry woven from gospel, blues, and the newly emerging R&B scene. For a talented young singer with a dream, it felt like the universe itself was aligning. Florence Ballard, along with a few teenage friends, began to navigate this buzzing environment, finding in the gospel-tinged clubs and street corner harmony groups the seeds of what would become the Supremes. Florence was born on June 30th, 1943, into a family of 15 children, which wasn't entirely unusual in that era for families with roots in the South. Her father, Jesse Ballard, was a steelworker who had sung professionally, though only briefly, back in his own youth. This was no glamorous existence. The Ballard family struggled financially, and sometimes they crowded into cramped living quarters. Yet through it all, Florence would later recount how music brightened their spirits and gave them a sense of unity. Even as a child, she sang in church, letting her voice resonate in the echoes of old pews, drawing on the depth and fervor of gospel to hone the soulful timbre that would soon captivate audiences. Music served as her emotional release and her way to connect with something bigger than herself. By the time Florence reached her early teens, she felt the pull of Detroit's local music scene. In neighborhoods throughout the city, talent shows and basement rehearsals were an almost daily fixture. Kids dreamed of being the next big act, mimicking the vocal stylings of pioneers like Aretha Franklin, who was also emerging in the city's gospel and R&B circles, or even the smoother harmonies championed by doo-wop groups of the day. It was a fertile landscape, and Florence possessed more than enough passion and raw skill to stand out. She had an uncanny ability to shift from a gentle, nuanced whisper to a thunderous, church-infused belt. Everyone who heard her took note. She was the kind of singer who made people stop whatever they were doing, look up and wonder, who is that girl? The year 1959 proved pivotal when Florence met Mary Wilson. Both girls attended different high schools, but crossed paths often enough in talent shows and local gatherings. Their voices complemented each other well. Florence's was bold and resonant, while Mary's had a silky warmth that slid easily into a background harmony. Soon after, they encountered another teenager from the Brewster Douglass housing projects, one Diana Ross, who was connected to them through mutual friends. Mary, Diana, and Florence discovered that together they had an interesting blend of vocal textures, a blend that could evolve into something remarkable. By 1960, they formed a group called the Primettes, originally envisioned as a sister group to the Primes. The Primettes' earliest goal was to snag a recording contract with the promising up-and-coming Motown label. At first, Florence seemed to be the glue binding everyone. She was said to be the most robust vocalist, the one who rooted their sound in gospel tradition, giving it street-level authenticity. Early on, she often took the lead in performances. Whether it was belting a known standard or an original tune they were tinkering with in a friend's basement, Florence's voice soared, unstoppable. At these small gigs, the audience might have been only a handful of neighbors or curious passers-by, but Florence's presence was already that of a star. She held the microphone with ease, relaxed and in command, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. This was her dream coming to life, and she wore it with pride. Not long after, the Primettes recorded a few rough demos. They approached Motown repeatedly, determined to be heard. Berry Gordy wasn't immediately sold. He thought the girls were too young and their sound might need refining. But they persisted, showing up unannounced at Hitsville, waiting in the lobby, trying to charm the staff into letting them sing. Eventually, the group's passion paid off when Gordy agreed to a trial run. They had the vibe, the look, and the raw talent. If he molded them, who knew what commercial heights they could reach? That molding began in earnest when the Primettes officially changed their name to the Supremes in early 1961. By then, Gordy had started assembling a stable of producers, songwriters, choreographers, and stylists who specialized in polishing young African-American talent into crossover sensations. For the Supremes, this meant vocal coaching, dance lessons, and eventually glamorous stage outfits. These changes were not always easy or welcome. Florence's robust, gospel-infused approach was honed in the church, where the spirit of the song was everything. The Motown style, on the other hand, demanded more restraint, more uniformity, and a graceful visual presentation that would appeal to mainstream television audiences. Still, the Supremes' early singles struggled to chart. They earned the unfortunate nickname No-Hit Supremes around the Motown studios. It was a rough time. The girls would wait their turn in the hallway, hearing the studio bustle with bigger acts like Marvin Gaye, the Miracles, or the Marvelettes. They were determined to stand out, to prove themselves. Florence, who had once been confident that her powerhouse vocals were the group's greatest asset, began to notice that Berry Gordy seemed increasingly focused on Diana Ross's style. Ross's voice, higher and more pop-friendly, was seen as a better commercial fit for radio. Slowly but surely, the group's dynamic shifted. Florence and Mary were asked to blend seamlessly into the background, accentuating Diana's leads. This was a strategic business move by Gordy. He was grooming Diana Ross as Motown's next superstar. But for Florence, it felt like a personal slight. She would later describe times in the studio when she felt overshadowed, told to stand back and let the marketable voice take center stage. By the time 1963 rolled around, the Supremes were still searching for their breakthrough hit. Gordy brought in the powerhouse songwriting team of Holland Dozier Holland, Eddie Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Brian Holland, to write material specifically tailored to the Supremes. Then came Where Did Our Love Go in 1964. This single soared to the top of the charts, marking a turning point not only for the group, but for the entire Motown enterprise. Almost overnight, the Supremes transitioned from underdogs to one of the hottest girl groups in America. Record labels and TV producers clamored for a piece of the action. Appearances on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show helped the Supremes break into mainstream living rooms across the nation. Black or white, young or old, everyone seemed smitten by these three elegant young women in matching gowns, gliding across the stage in perfectly synchronized dance steps. But behind that polished veneer, Florence was grappling with a harsh new reality. Her role had been diminished to backing vocals on nearly every hit. Diana was the official lead singer, and Mary was right beside Florence in the background. Florence's sense of self, once firmly rooted in her remarkable voice, began to erode. She'd dream of standing center stage, belting out the big notes, but Motown's machine had different plans. Gordy believed that Diana's lighter, more pop-oriented tone would appeal to a broader market segment. The label strongly encouraged or outright demanded that Florence conform, keep a lower profile, and follow the choreography. Publicly, she was beaming with the group, wearing the same glittery gowns, performing for sold-out audiences in major venues, and traveling the world. Privately, she felt like a ghost on stage. People in the Motown circle started noticing that Florence was becoming more withdrawn. She sometimes showed up late for rehearsals or missed them altogether. Rumors circulated about her struggles with depression and her disillusionment over her place in the group. Adding to her burdens, Florence had begun a relationship with Thomas Chapman, whom she married in 1968. While the relationship would yield 3 daughters, it wasn't a fairy tale romance. Financial strains, the stress of fame, and personal demons weighed heavily on the young couple. Florence confided in close friends that she felt like she was losing control, losing her voice, losing her dreams, and soon she feared losing her livelihood. The critical blow came in 1967, right at the height of the Supremes' stardom. Berry Gordy, along with Motown's upper management, decided that Florence was no longer the right fit for the group's image. Officially, they cited issues with her professionalism, missing gigs, alleged drinking, conflicts with group members, and weight gain. In a more candid reflection, Mary Wilson later admitted that while Florence did have personal struggles, the bigger picture was that Gordy wanted a streamlined product for mainstream America, and that meant the focus was on Diana Ross. It was easier to sideline Florence than deal with the complexities of her unhappiness or her unique voice that might not have aligned perfectly with Gordy's vision. One fateful day, Florence was called into a meeting. The conversation was terse. Gordy informed her that her services were no longer required and that Motown wouldn't be extending her contract. She was effectively cut off from everything she helped create. The group had racked up numerous chart-topping singles: Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop, In the Name of Love, that had catapulted them to international fame. Yet the original founder was shown the door without ceremony, apology, or the sort of golden parachute one might expect for someone so integral to Motown's success. In shock and heartbreak, Florence left. Cindy Birdsong from Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells was quickly drafted in her place, and the Supremes were rebranded as Diana Ross and the Supremes, shortly thereafter, making official what had been implied for a long time. Diana Ross was the star, and everyone else was an accessory. Florence tried to pick up the pieces. She sued Motown for royalties, believing she had been shortchanged and that her dismissal was mishandled. She signed a brief solo contract with ABC Records, releasing a handful of tracks in the late 1960s, but none achieved substantial chart success. ABC, wary of crossing paths with the mighty Motown machine, didn't pour much promotional support into her solo work. Additionally, Florence's self-confidence had taken a massive hit. She sometimes sabotaged potential opportunities, either by not showing up for crucial recording sessions or getting into disagreements with producers. The heartbreak, the sense of betrayal, and the spiral of depression were all culminating. During this period, she and her husband had their children, and the financial burden became overwhelming. She tried to keep performing in small clubs, often reverting to singing the old Supremes hits that brought her fleeting glimpses of the glory she once knew. But these shows were fewer and further between. Despite her best efforts, money was scarce. In the early 1970s, Florence found herself on public assistance, raising 3 daughters in a rented home in Detroit. Friends and relatives recall the once vibrant singer spending long hours alone, battling depression, feeling as though the world had moved on and forgotten her. Amid these difficult years, there were a few hopeful moments when she made local headlines, performing in benefit concerts or making cameo appearances at smaller Motown-related events. There's a little-known story about Florence once stepping onto the stage of a tiny Detroit bar in 1974, surprising the handful of patrons who happened to be there. She performed a raw, heartbreaking rendition of People. Those who were present said the entire room went silent. She was singing for her life. Tears streamed down her cheeks when she hit the high notes, reminding everyone that beneath the layers of sorrow, that glorious powerhouse voice was still there. But once the song ended, the applause faded quickly, the city's noise enveloped them again, and Florence slipped back into anonymity. One of the most poignant recollections from this period comes from Mary Wilson herself. In a later interview, Mary said she bumped into Florence at a grocery store parking lot, an encounter that was both heartbreaking and enlightening. Florence, pushing a cart of groceries, looked tired, older than her age, yet when she saw Mary, she mustered a smile. They spoke briefly. Mary recalled how, for a moment, she saw a spark in Florence's eyes, like she remembered what it felt like to be on top of the world, shimmering in a stage spotlight. But as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared again. They parted ways, promising to catch up soon, fully aware that the era that bound them together was long gone. Around 1975, Florence seemed to rally a bit. She made plans to re-enter the music industry, if only in a modest way. She lined up small performances and started talking to producers who might help her record new music. There were rumors of a potential contract with a smaller label that specialized in soul revival. She even began practicing regularly at a church near her home, refining her range and hoping to bring that old gospel fervor back into the studio. Friends observed that she was losing a bit of weight, smiling more often, and talking excitedly about a future that might finally be within reach again. Tragically, these hopes didn't come to fruition. In February of 1976, Florence Ballard was hospitalized for cardiac arrest. She died shortly after at just 32 years old. The official cause was listed as coronary thrombosis, essentially a blood clot in the coronary arteries. Some pointed to her years of stress, depression, and financial struggles as contributing factors. Others suggested that her sudden passing was a cruel twist of fate. Whatever the exact medical or spiritual cause, the outcome was heartbreaking. One of the founding mothers of the Motown sound was gone, leaving behind 3 young daughters and a legacy that had been overshadowed by the swirling narrative of Diana Ross's ascendance. The public reaction was muted, in part because Florence had long faded from the mainstream spotlight. Fans of the Supremes who were deeply aware of the group's early history mourned her intensely, lamenting the injustice that had been done to her. They understood that Florence was a key piece of the puzzle, the original voice that gave the Supremes their soulful foundation. But to a broader audience, especially a younger crowd, the name Florence Ballard barely registered. Diana Ross, by this time, was a global superstar, branching into film, winning awards, her face adorning magazine covers. It was Diana's name, not Florence's, that the world remembered. Despite the public's limited awareness, Florence's funeral in Detroit drew local celebrities, family, and fans who recognized the magnitude of her contribution. Mary Wilson was said to be inconsolable, reflecting openly on the good old days when the 3 girls harmonized in living rooms and local halls, dreaming of stardom. Berry Gordy sent flowers and condolences, though many felt it was too little, too late. The sadness was palpable, and there was an unspoken sense that this tragedy might have been prevented, or at least that Florence's story could have ended differently if she had received more support, both financially and emotionally, from the industry she had helped to build. In the years following her death, a swirl of controversies and debate has kept her memory alive among historians, music enthusiasts, and Motown devotees. Some blame Gordy and the Motown machine for being ruthless, discarding artists who didn't fit the mold. Others argue that Florence struggled with her own demons, alcohol, mental health issues, self-sabotaging behavior, and that perhaps Motown couldn't keep investing in someone who was spiraling. Mary Wilson's later comments about Florence were compassionate, but also honest about the complexities behind the scenes. "We were kids," Mary once said, paraphrased from an interview. "We didn't know how to handle success, how to handle the conflict. The machine was bigger than us." One under-discussed element is how the intense pressure of crossing over into mainstream TV affected artists. The world saw them as glamorous, but behind closed doors, that pressure was immense. The famously rigorous Motown Charm School, run by artist development director Maxine Powell, was there to teach etiquette, poise, and how to carry oneself in front of white audiences who might initially be skeptical of black performers. Any misstep in public might jeopardize that mainstream acceptance. In such a high-stakes environment, an outspoken or strong-willed personality like Florence, especially one who was anchored in a more raw gospel style, could easily be seen as risky. Gordy's solution was to streamline the group by focusing on the singer whose persona he could shape most successfully for television. When reflecting on Florence's legacy, it's vital to note just how essential her voice was to the early Supremes. While many fans never got to hear her belt as led on a major hit single, there are early live recordings, B-sides, and unreleased studio takes floating around collectors' circles that show off Florence's formidable range. Some of these recordings reveal a singer capable of tackling big, emotive ballads or up-tempo gospel-driven tracks that would have fit comfortably in the repertoire of some of the era's biggest soul stars. Had the dice rolled differently, we might remember Florence Ballard as one of the era's definitive soul singers. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.